All right, welcome everyone to our October Curators Tour. This exhibition is American Impressionism, Treasures from the Daywood Collection, and it is a traveling exhibition. But before we get started, for you guys and for those of you who are joining us on Facebook, my name is Elizabeth, and I give a lot of our tours here at the museum for our adult audiences, and I'm excited to have you guys with us today too. If you have any questions, either here in person or on Facebook, feel free to just pop your hand up, ask a question, or if you type a question on Facebook, Caitlin will relay it to me. So we're going to go ahead and get started. This exhibition comes from the Huntington Museum of Art in West Virginia, and it is all selections from one couple's collection. Their names were, Arthur Dayton and Ruth Woods Dayton, and they combined their names to call it the Daywood Collection. They were just scholars of West Virginian and law history, and Ruth was an amateur painter herself, and they were just a couple who really enjoyed collecting artwork, and they wanted to preserve it and be able to share it with individuals after they had passed away. So they donated their collection to the Huntington Museum, and we are lucky enough to be able to have that here for a couple months. So this exhibition is American Impressionism, which you will notice is different from French Impressionism, and we'll talk about kind of the differences as we go along in the exhibition. So the first piece we are going to look at is The Bridge in Autumn by Wilson Henri Irvine. So Irvine was a very prominent American Impressionist painter, and he often painted the landscape of New England. And New England itself was a very popular subject matter for American painters. And the reason for that is because it gave a sense of safety and nostalgia. Now with French Impressionism, we tend to forget that it was a very cutting edge and avant-garde style when it was first introduced into the art world. These artists were thought of as radical, and their style was ugly. No one wanted to look at it. It was terrible. But we now appreciate it for different reasons. But the French artists were really celebrating modernity and industrialism and looking at what it meant to be the bourgeoisie class or the upper middle class, where they're very well off, and they now have something called free time. And no one really has had free time unless you were royalty or very wealthy. So the French Impressionists would often paint well-dressed men and women walking through the park, having parties, or they would paint train stations with the steam billowing out, or they would paint country homes showing what this class was doing. With American painters, by the time Impressionism came to America, it had lost its edge in Europe, and it was much more of a appreciated and welcomed style. And Americans as a whole had also been going through rapid industrialization during the 19th century. And as you can see, since this bridges the 19th century and the early 20th century, there was also World War I in the middle of it. So there was a feeling of unease and fearing what the future may hold. And so much change had happened in the last 50 years. So that's one reason why we have a lot of landscapes and pictures of the seaside or in the forest with American Impressionism, rather than so many fancy ladies, which we will have. We do have those, but in this painting we see the Connecticut landscape, where Irvine is really celebrating the American past, where the original English settlers would have landed in New England and created these hand-built bridges, or he would also capture fields with uneven rock-hewn walls separating all of the different fields. And it's a sense of peace, and it's a way to escape the growing cities with urbanization and the kind of unease of what's going on. So what do you guys think of this painting? Is this something you kind of expected seeing with American Impressionism, or it's just a nice painting?
Everything's a little more defined.
It is a little more defined, yeah.
The French,
Mm-hmm.
like you said, it's less edgy. landscapes from the 15 or 1600s.
Yeah, it is, like with its color and just kind of the way it's picked out. Yeah, and we'll talk about why it's a little different as we go on and look at a few more too. But we also, as I'd mentioned, we do have some pictures or some paintings that display a more traditional Impressionist painting. And one we have here is by Irving R. Wiles, and it is called On the Porch. While we are still set in the countryside in a wealthy family's retreat, as she's on this cabin, we can see like a lake behind her with some hills and some woods off in the background. It looks very peaceful. But we also know that she is a very well-off woman. She's dressed very nicely. She's dressed to the nines, the way she's holding herself, and we can tell that she is very posed with the way that she is sitting. This is actually Wiles, the painter's wife, and she was the subject for his paintings very often before he became well known. And Wiles himself was trained in France by very prominent painters and teachers, and he had the same instructor as John Singer Sargent. So you'll kind of see here that he does have a lot of the same application with brushstrokes and how he portrays the fabric like Sargent. And because of that, here in America, he became the #1 portrait painter for the affluent class behind Sargent, because Sargent spent a lot of his time in England and in France. He wasn't really in America a whole lot, even though we claim him very passionately. But Wiles was the one who the rich and famous went to in the day. And some of his most prominent sitters were Theodore Roosevelt and William Jennings Bryan. So we see here one of his portraits before he really became Wiles, the famous portraiture. But we still have that sense of romanticism. This is a very kind of wistful pose. It reminds me of when high school seniors get their pictures taken and you have one where she's just looking off into the distance, contemplating life. And we also have a different type of romanticism that was captured in American Impressionism. Okay, we are going to look at these 4 paintings as a whole, as a group. So you feel free to spread out and check them out. I'll stand off to the side here because I know they're smaller. But as the 20th century was moving on, many of these were painted in the 1910s into the 1920s. There was a growth in interest in paintings that portrayed the American Southwest, the deserts of Arizona, New Mexico, and painters were drawn there themselves because of the rich colors in the landscape. Because a lot of times when people think of a desert, it's just brown, it's sandy, but in the American Southwest, we have those rich reds, those coppers, those purples, and those pinks. And so painters really wanted to capture that. And the impressionistic application allowed you to do that. With that quick painting, you can capture the changing light and see how it changes throughout the day. But painters like Inger Irving Krauss and William Robinson Lee, they wanted to capture the lifestyle of the Native Americans who even at that time, it was threatened. Their way of life had been pushed further and further west as cities grew and grew from the east. They just kept getting pushed further and further, and now they are into the deserts. And it's a very romantic and stylized application of what these individuals were doing on a day-to-day basis, especially from Krauss. He set out to capture the traditions and the crafts of Native Americans, but he didn't want to paint in the en plein air style of Impressionist. Rather, he reverted back to his academic French style that he'd been instructed in, and he would pose people in his studio. So what that meant was, while he had an appreciation of this culture that was different from his own that he wanted to preserve through painting, he didn't always know what the artifacts were used for that he was portraying. So he would have someone holding it, like we have here in the Eagle plaque, but he's not really showing us what that plaque would have been used for. We just have what would be known as just a genre scene. It's a quaint scene of something that he thought looked nice. And the same here with the Brookside. We have a young Native American who appears to be fishing with his bow and a spear, but he's very posed. This is how Kaus imagines Native Americans to go about their day, and so that's how he is captured. One artist who was a little more realistic and not as posed and stylized was Lee, and he spent about 10-12 years traveling yearly to the Southwest. And rather than taking people into his studio and posing them, he would sketch individuals as he saw them going about their day, riding their horses, going through their villages, and he then painted them from what he would remember and what he would see. So we have two Native American men here in a much more modern style of dress. As this was painted in 1924, this is clothes you would have seen many people wearing at that time. They haven't been dressed up to look a certain way. And they're just riding their horses through the scenery. Now, even though this is more realistic, it is still romanticized. We can kind of sense this sense of like freedom and excitement, and that goes along with the idea of the pure primitive, which was a prevalent idea at the turn of the century. And it kind of harkens back to what was known as the noble savage when Europeans were coming to the U.S., what became the U.S., then it was the colonies, where they were interacting with Native Americans, where they're like, oh, these people are noble in their own right, but they're still, as what they called then, savage, which we would now just call a different culture that was just different from European standards. And that idea, even though they didn't use the same term, pure primitive is, oh, these individuals, they're much more connected to nature as opposed to us living in cities with industrialization. That means they are more pure in their own way of life. We need to honor them, and we need to, if we can't be like them, we can wish we were like them and have these paintings in our home connecting us to the Southwest. And we see that again in the painting down on the end by Albert Grohl. And he has a tiny little figure, solitary down there, just walking amongst the crags and the hills. But what I also think is interesting about these is they were, most of them painted about 10 years before movies really started to take off. And Westerns were the popular genre in the 30s and the 40s. And we can see how these romanticized and stylized portraits or paintings would really influence that imagery that would stick until well into the 60s and 70s. When you start to get your spaghetti westerns and your Clint Eastwood movies, you almost always have a figure like this, which, while these painters were trying to honor something, they created it in their own iconography that stuck. A very romantic one. So now we are going to move on to some paintings that will help explain why we have some kind of darker imagery as opposed to the light French Impressionism. We'll go right over here. And as we make our way, you'll notice that we do have some very light and airy landscapes off to the side and some domestic scenes of young ladies in their homes. And like I said, that's a very popular trope for American Impressionism, and we do have that light brushstroke that we would normally see with the French. And then we have this painting, where it's very dark. I encourage you to get closer so you can really see what's going on in there. But this is by Ross Sterling Turner, and this is also the painting that began the Woods collection, or the Woods Dayton collection. Sorry, I got tongue-tied. This was presented to them as a gift on their wedding day from the artist, and from there they collected over 200 pieces, and 80 of them were paintings. So it's really, this is the painting that began it all. But this painting is done by an American, and it is impressionistic, but it's in the Munich or German style. German Impressionism was much darker and earthier, and I would almost say muddier than French Impressionism. They don't have those pinks and those yellows and those bright greens. It's much more down to earth and you could say real. But he does have that very expressive and aggressive almost brushstroke in here, and you can see the thick paint. Now, Turner did this while he was studying in Germany, and rather than study directly under the German instructors, he actually studied with many American painters who were already there and who had received instruction, and then he worked. So he was kind of once removed from the German instructors. And it's interesting to note that there were so many Americans who were there studying in Germany rather than France. And we have a lot of Hoosier Impressionist painters within our own permanent collection, and many of them also studied in Germany or were instructed by those who came back from Germany. So when you see Impressionist painters in Indiana or even the Midwest, they're often influenced by that German style where it's much heavier and darker, and it's just not as light and airy as others. But we can see that he's still kind of learning the style. There's some areas where it's a little more realistic and a little more tight, like we see here with the boat and the gentlemen who are raising or lowering the sail, and then with our windmill as well. But then off on the edges, you can see him really leaning into the Impressionist style. But as we mentioned how the American Impressionist movement bridged the 19th and 20th century, by the time 1914, 15 was rolling around, the more modern styles from Europe were trickling into America. And we can see how those styles started to influence Impressionism here. So these two paintings, one by Arthur Bowen Davies and the other by John Sloan, they were done around 1915. And in 1913, the Armory Show took place in New York. And that was one of the first times that many American painters were exposed to Cubism, Fauvism, Post-Impressionism, and that's when you start to get your very dramatic, unearthly colors. You get your bright backgrounds against bright like blues and teal skies against pink and red trees, and you start to have more of swatches of color as opposed to strokes of color. And we can see that here in Davies' Esmeralda. We have a very flat and gradient of blues down to teals down to greens for the sea, but then on top of that we have this very like Cezanne style of cliff. We can see like the geometric chunks that make up this little cliff or outlook, rather than seeing the different textures of what the grass or the bushes would have been. And she's just kind of plopped right down onto that. And that's not to say that Davies didn't know what he was doing. He was a very prolific and very talented American painter, but he was beginning to have this excessively eclectic style as he picked and chose from different modern styles that he wanted to implement into his own paintings. And that's why we get this composition where it doesn't really seem to make sense with that flat background and then our textured cliff and lady on top. And he did get influence from very traditional sources like Greek and Roman myths, and he was interested in the pre-Raphaelites, how they looked back to like Renaissance style portraiture, but I couldn't figure out where Esmeralda came from. I was searching, so if anyone on Facebook knows Esmeralda other than from the Hunchback of Notre Dame, any type of myth, I would love to know, because I was trying to find it and I know she's somewhere. And we can also see the influence of Cezanne and especially Van Gogh in this painting. It's very reminiscent of his kind of Starry Night or his sunflowers, because we can see the thick, broken up applications of paint as they layer and layer on top of each other. We have those swatches like Cezanne, but it's really Van Gogh who really influenced Sloan with his painting here. And it's energetic. We can tell what way all of the different foliage is growing, what way the wind is blowing with the wave being flipped and pushed back into the ocean. It's expressive. And it's interesting to note that neither of these artists ever went fully abstract, like many of the Cubist paintings that you would see from Picasso or Georges Braque, where you can't tell what it was. And the same with Italian Futurism, where you'd have these sculptures where they're trying to capture movement and it looks like geometric shapes that have been stacked on top of each other. Both Davies and Sloan were interested in these styles, but they never let their own artwork truly fall into abstraction. They still held on to a little realism and a little of Impressionism as well. And the last thing we'll look at are some winter scenes with Impressionism, because you'll see that even though they all capture snow, almost none of them will ever really show pure white in their paintings. So we can look at all three of these, and you'll note that the overwhelming color for the snow is often blue. And if you think of what our own snow looks like when it falls, inevitably in a month and a half, 2 months, while we think of it as white, once you really start to look at it, you'll start to see all of the different colors in the snow. You'll see the greens and the blues, sometimes pinks depending on the day. And I think that's something that's really interesting with Impressionism, be it American Impressionism or French Impressionism. You can really start to see and think about all of the different colors that we see on a daily basis but kind of gloss over because we just think of, oh, it's white, that's what snow is. But really you can see much more, and even in the leaves on the trees or different flowers or even the clouds in the sky. Do you guys have any questions? I feel like we went really quick today, but we had a smaller group than last month. Do we have any Facebook questions?
I don't have any Facebook questions, but Marlena Cooper says that you look very cute.
Thank you. Thank you, Marlena. Okay, well, that is the end of our tour then. You are free to go throughout the rest of the exhibition and the museum as well, and I'll hang around if any questions do come up. I'd be happy to answer them for you. Okay.